Stop scrolling. That ordinary-looking Washington quarter in your collection could have a story most people would never believe. Scratchy, toned, and seemingly worth just 25 cents. But what if it carries a rare mint era, extraordinary variety, or elite-grade condition that collectors are desperately searching for? Today, we're uncovering the real value, rare eras, auction history, and hidden secrets behind the Washington quarter. Before you spend it, check that overall Numismatics and look closely, because the difference between an ordinary quarter and a remarkable collectible can be almost invisible. Let's get started. First up to in 1974 Washington quarter dollar, United States of America, Denver mint, copper-nickel clad composition, scratched and toned condition. And here is where the story becomes much more interesting than the coin's ordinary appearance suggests. At first glance, a scratched, circulated 1974 quarter may look like nothing more than spending money from another generation. But the real fascination begins when collectors ask a different question. Not, is every 1974 quarter rare? But what unusual characteristic could transform one particular example into a collectible? The answer is important because the regular 1974 Washington quarter is not inherently an ultra-rare coin. The Denver Mint produced approximately 353,160,300 examples, and PCGS classifies the normal issue as common overall. Yet the same database records an auction high of $1,450 for an MS67 Plus example sold in November 2021, showing how dramatically condition can separate an ordinary example from a superb one. PCGS also estimates millions surviving in high grades, while noting that MS67 and higher examples become considerably harder to obtain. So if you have a scratched and toned 1974 quarter in your collection, the dramatic truth is not that the date alone makes it worth thousands. The excitement comes from discovering whether your coin contains something genuinely unusual, an authentic mint era, an unusual die characteristic, or an exceptional level of preservation hidden beneath years of circulation. Understand why this quarter matters. We have to travel back to 1974, a turbulent year in American history. The United States was dealing with the aftermath of the Vietnam War, intense inflation, energy shortages, and the continuing Watergate scandal. The oil crisis that began in 1973 was affecting gasoline prices and household budgets, while Americans were experiencing an economy very different from the prosperity associated with earlier post-war decades. President Richard Nixon was still in office at the beginning of the year, but the political crisis surrounding Watergate was becoming increasingly difficult to contain, and by August 1974, Nixon would resign, making Gerald Ford the first person to become president without being elected as either president or vice president. Against this extraordinary backdrop, millions of Washington quarters were moving through American commerce. People used them for parking meters, vending machines, laundromats, stores, tolls, and everyday purchases. The 1974 quarter therefore represents more than a piece of metal. It is a small survivor from a period when American society was experiencing enormous economic and political change. And unlike the silver Washington quarters produced before 1965, the 1974 issue was made from the copper-nickel clad composition introduced for circulating quarters in 1965. Approximately 75% copper and 25% nickel over a pure copper center. It weighs about 5.67 grams, measures 24.3 millimeters across, and carries a reeded edge. That distinction matters enormously, because a normal 1974 quarter is not a silver quarter, despite how some old coins may appear after years of tunning. The Washington quarter itself has a remarkable history. The series began in 1932 to commemorate the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birth, and its original design was created by sculptor John Flanagan, whose portrait of Washington was based on the famous bust by French sculptor Jonathan Hudon. On the obverse, Washington faces left, surrounded by the inscriptions Liberty, In God We Trust, and the date. On the reverse, an American eagle spreads its wings above a bundle of arrows, with two olive branches beneath it, and the inscriptions United States of America, EPLUBUS UNUM, and $quarter. By 1974, Americans had been using this design for more than 4 decades, but the coin had undergone a major transformation in its metallic composition. The transition away from silver was driven by rising silver prices and concerns about the cost and availability of silver for circulating coinage. Thus, when the Denver Mint struck the 1974 D Washington quarter, it was participating in a modern era of American coin production in which huge quantities of clad coins were being manufactured for everyday commerce. The Denver D Muntmuck identifies the production facility, and because the mintage was so large, simply finding the date and Muntmuck is not enough to establish rarity. In numismatics, mintage tells you how many were originally made. Survival, condition, varieties, errors, and collector demand determine how scarce desirable examples become. PCGS specifically describes the 1974 D as having a significantly large mintage and notes that many examples circulated, with ordinary coins readily available through lower uncirculated and circulated grades. Now comes the most important part of the investigation: varieties and errors. There is no established large date versus small date rarity comparable to some other U.S. coin issues that should automatically make an ordinary 1974 D Washington quarter valuable. Likewise, collectors should be extremely cautious about internet claims of a mysterious 1974 D double die, repunched muntmuck, or overdate that supposedly turns every example into a fortune. The recognized market for this date is much more strongly influenced by condition and genuine mint errors. A true double die begins during die production, when the hub impresses the design into the die more than once with a misalignment between impressions. The resulting doubling is transferred to every coin struck from that die. This is fundamentally different from machine doubling, which can create flat, shelf-like secondary images during the striking process, but usually carries much less collector premium. A repunched muntmuck would involve the muntmuck being applied or prepared more than once, something that was relevant to earlier hand-punched muntmuck eras, but should not simply be assumed on a 1974 D coin. Die cracks occur when a working die develops a fracture after repeated stress, and the raised line appearing on struck coins is a result of metal flowing into that recessed crack in the die. Off-center strikes happen when the planchet is not properly positioned within the striking collar. Broodstruck occur when the collar fails to restrain the planchet properly, and wrong planchet errors happen when a coin is struck on a blank intended for another denomination. These distinctions are crucial because a damaged coin and a mint error can look surprisingly similar to an inexperienced eye. And the 1974 D issue has a particularly fascinating documented error history. Heritage auction records show genuine 1974 D Washington quarters struck on cent planchets, meaning the quarter design was struck onto a planchet intended for a Lincoln cent. One such 1974 D example, graded MS-64 red and brown, sold for $1,762.50 in September 2013, while another 1974 D quarter struck on a cent planchet graded MS-62 red and brown sold for $705 in 2013. Heritage's archive also records a 1974 D quarter struck on a 3.09 gram 1 cent planchet that sold for $1,150 in 2011, as well as other examples in the hundreds to low thousands of dollars. Even more dramatic, Heritage records a 1974 D quarter die cap with a brockage reverse that sold for $1,265 in 2006. Those are the kinds of circumstances that can genuinely transform a common date into a major collectible, not an ordinary scratch, not ordinary tunning, and not a rumor about a secret variety, but a documented minting mistake that can be explained through the manufacturing process. A wrong planchet error can also be verified through measurements, weight, diameter, metal composition, design characteristics, and professional examination. This is why the phrase, 1974 D quarter worth thousands, needs context. The ordinary coin does not command those prices. Extraordinary authenticated errors can. Next up imagine reaching into an old jar of coins and pulling out a scratched, toned quarter that looks like nothing more than 25 cents from another era. The date reads 1973, there is no mint mark, and at first glance it seems completely ordinary. But this is where the story becomes fascinating. The 1973 Philadelphia Washington quarter had an enormous mintage of 346,924,000 pieces, meaning the ordinary example is not rare simply because of its date or missing mint mark. Yet among millions of ordinary coins, collectors know that condition, striking quality, die characteristics, and genuine mint errors can transform an otherwise common quarter into a much more desirable numismatic discovery. Professional auction records show just how dramatic the difference can become. PCGS reports a $2,880 auction record for a 1973 regular strike quarter graded MS68, sold by Heritage Auctions on August 31, 2025. So if you have a scratched and toned 1973 quarter in your hand, the realistic question is not, is every 1973 quarter worth thousands? The real question is much more intriguing. What exactly is hiding on this particular coin? To understand that mystery, we have to return to America in 1973. The United States was entering a turbulent period of economic and political change. Richard Nixon was president. The country was dealing with the continuing consequences of the Vietnam War. Inflation was becoming increasingly noticeable, and the energy crisis that would explode later in the year was beginning to reshape American economic expectations. The country was also experiencing rapid technological and cultural change. Everyday Americans still depended heavily on physical cash for ordinary purchases, from gasoline and groceries to newspapers, vending machines, parking meters, and countless small transactions. A quarter was not merely an object for collectors, it was working money. Millions of 1973 Washington quarters traveled through pockets, cash registers, banks, vending machines, and drawers. Many were exposed to friction, moisture, chemicals, and contact with other coins. That history explains why finding a truly pristine example today can be far more difficult than the original production figure might suggest. The Washington quarter itself has one of the most recognizable designs in American coinage. The series began in 1932 to commemorate the 200th anniversary of George Washington's birth, and the design created by sculptor John Flanagan became an enduring part of American currency. On the obverse, Washington faces left, surrounded by the inscriptions Liberty, In God We Trust, and the date. The reverse, used during 1973, features a powerful eagle with outstretched wings, holding arrows, with an olive branch beneath it, and the inscriptions United States of America, EPLUBUSUNUM, and quarter dollar. The 1973 issue belongs to the modern clad era that began in 1965, after the mint abandoned the traditional silver composition for circulating quarters. The regular 1973 Philadelphia coin weighs approximately 5.67 grams, measures about 24.3 millimeters, and consists of a copper-nickel outer layer over a copper center. Now comes one of the most important facts about the coin in this video. The absence of a mint mark is completely normal for a 1973 Philadelphia quarter. Philadelphia coins did not carry a mint mark during this period. The P mint mark would not begin appearing on circulating Philadelphia quarters until 1980. That means a 1973 quarter with no mint mark is not automatically an error. In fact, it is exactly what a normal Philadelphia example should look like. The Philadelphia Mint produced 346,924,000 regular 1973 quarters, while Denver produced 232,977,400 with a D mint mark. San Francisco produced 2,760,339 proof quarters for collectors. These numbers immediately destroy one common misconception. A coin does not become rare simply because it has no mint mark. Rarity is determined by the surviving population, grade distribution, varieties, errors, demand, and the number of examples that possess a particular combination of desirable characteristics. This is where survival rate becomes much more interesting than mintage. Imagine nearly 347 million quarters entering circulation. The overwhelming majority were not treated as collectibles. They were spent. They were dropped. They were carried in pockets with keys and other coins. They were stacked, counted, transporting, and eventually removed from circulation or placed into collections without special preservation. Consequently, the number of surviving coins in all grades can be vastly different from the original mintage, while the population of genuinely high-grade examples can be dramatically smaller. PCGS specifically tracks survival estimates and population information for certified coins because collectors need to distinguish between a coin that was produced in huge numbers and a coin that remains difficult to find in exceptional condition. This is why an MS-67 or MS-68 1973 quarter can be far more interesting than a bag full of ordinary circulated pieces. The date is common, the exceptional preservation is not. Strike quality adds another layer to the story. During production, a blank copper-nickel-clad planchet had to be fed between two dies and struck with enormous pressure. The quality of the final coin depended on the condition of the dies, the preparation of the planchet, the alignment of the striking equipment, and the force and timing of the strike. A coin could technically be uncirculated while still showing weakness in certain design areas. Collectors examining high-grade 1973 quarters therefore look closely at Washington's hair and facial details, the lettering, the eagle's feathers, the rims, and the overall sharpness of the design. A coin with fewer contact marks and stronger definition can separate itself dramatically from another coin of the exact same date. This is one reason the $2,880 MS-68 auction result matters. The price was not generated by the date alone, but by the extraordinary condition and scarcity of such a high-grade certified survivor. Then there is the subject that can turn an ordinary quarter into a genuine numismatic detective story: mint errors and varieties. Collectors searching a 1973 no-mint mark quarter should not expect a famous, universally recognized 1973 Philadelphia rare variety, comparable to some legendary key-date varieties. Instead, the excitement comes from discovering a legitimate error or unusual die characteristic. Possible errors across this era include off-center strikes, clipped planchets, broad strikes, die cracks, die breaks, multiple strikes, struck-through errors, and dramatic doubled or misaligned impressions. An off-center strike occurs when the planchet is not properly centered between the dies, leaving part of the design missing and exposing an area of blank metal. The greater the displacement, especially when the date remains visible, the more visually compelling the error can become. Some documented 1973 error pieces have sold for hundreds of dollars, including a reported example combining a major off-center strike with a brockage, demonstrating how unusual combinations can attract specialist attention. Understanding how such errors happen makes the coin even more fascinating. The process begins long before a quarter reaches a person's pocket. Dies are manufactured from hubs or related die-making processes, and imperfections introduced during preparation can sometimes create repeated characteristics on multiple coins. Mechanical doubling, hub-related doubling, die deterioration, die cracks, and other abnormalities can all produce features that inexperienced collectors may mistake for valuable doubled dies. A true double die phenomenon results from a problem during the die-making process that creates a duplicated design impression on the die itself. It is fundamentally different from ordinary machine doubling created during the striking process. During striking, other errors can occur because of mechanical failures, improper planchet positioning, die movement, or foreign material interfering with the dies. This distinction is crucial because the internet is filled with photographs of coins claimed to be double dies, when they are actually examples of common mechanical damage or post-mint alteration. The famous categories of large date, small date, repunched mint mark, and overdate varieties also require special caution when examining a 1973 Philadelphia quarter. A no-mint mark Philadelphia coin cannot have a conventional repunched mint mark because there was no mint mark to punch into the die. Likewise, collectors should not assume that every slightly unusual-looking digit is a recognized large date or small date variety. Some dates appear different because of wear, strike quality, dye erosion, lighting, photography, or damage. A genuine collectible variety must be supported by repeatable diagnostic characteristics and preferably recognized by authoritative variety references or professional attribution. The same principle applies to die cracks. A small raised line can be interesting, but not every scratch, gouge, or discoloration represents a mint-made die crack. On a coin described as scratched and toned, separating mint-created features from damage becomes especially important. And that brings us to the coin's surfaces. A scratched 1973 quarter faces an immediate disadvantage because scratches are post-mint damage unless evidence shows otherwise. Natural tunning, however, is a different story. Over decades, copper-nickel surfaces can develop gray, golden, brown, or other subtle coloration as the coin interacts with its environment. Next up to in the 1973 D Washington quarter dollar, United States of America. At first glance, this coin looks almost impossible to associate with serious numismatic money. It is a common-looking copper-nickel-clad quarter, perhaps scratched, perhaps toned, perhaps carrying the scars of decades spent in circulation. Yet this is exactly where the story becomes fascinating, because the 1973 D Washington quarter sits at the intersection of enormous production, selective survival, high-grade scarcity, and the possibility of unusual mint-made characteristics. The Denver Mint produced 232,977,400 examples in 1973, a number large enough to make the coin seem permanently common. But mintage is only the beginning of a coin's story. What matters today is how many survived in exceptional condition, how many display legitimate varieties or errors, and how strongly collectors compete for the very finest certified examples. One documented NGC MS68 example brought $2,750 in an August 2022 sale, a remarkable result for a quarter whose original face value was only 25 cents. So before dismissing that scratched 1973 D quarter in an old collection, look closer, because the difference between an ordinary example and an extraordinary one can be hidden in details measured in fractions of a millimeter. To understand why this coin exists, we have to travel back to an America that was experiencing enormous change. In 1973, Richard Nixon was president, the Vietnam War was moving toward its final American phase, and the Watergate scandal was rapidly becoming a national political crisis. The year began with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, formally establishing an agreement intended to end the war and leading to the withdrawal of U.S. forces and advisors from Vietnam. But by spring and summer, Watergate dominated the headlines, with televised Senate hearings exposing Americans to an extraordinary political scandal. Then in October, the Middle East conflict triggered an Arab oil embargo against the United States, producing an energy crisis, shortages, inflationary pressure, and a dramatic increase in oil prices. Every one of those events forms part of the environment in which the 1973 D quarter entered everyday American commerce. This was not a commemorative coin made to sit in a display case. It was working money. It traveled through gas stations, supermarkets, restaurants, vending machines, parking meters, cash registers, and countless American pockets. That circulation history is one reason condition becomes so important today. The Washington quarter itself has an extraordinary history. The familiar portrait of George Washington appeared on the quarter beginning in 1932, replacing the earlier Standing Liberty design as part of the commemoration of Washington's bicentennial. The obverse was designed by sculptor John Flanagan, whose left-facing portrait became one of the most recognizable images in American coinage. The reverse of the traditional Washington quarter showed an eagle with wings spread, standing over a bundle of arrows with olive branches beneath it. By 1973, however, the quarter was no longer a silver coin. Beginning in 1965, the United States Mint removed silver from circulating quarters and adopted copper-nickel-clad construction. That distinction matters enormously when examining a 1973 D piece. A genuine 1973 D regular strike quarter is not a 90% silver quarter, and its value should not be based on silver content. Its collectible potential comes instead from condition, rarity of particular characteristics, eras, varieties, and the strength of the collector market. Now examine the coin itself. On the obverse is Washington's dignified profile, facing left, surrounded by United States of America, Liberty, in God we trust, and the denomination designation. On the reverse is the powerful eagle, its wings extended above a bundle of arrows, with olive branches symbolizing peace beneath. Design creates a fascinating contrast. Washington represents the founding generation of the Republic, while the eagle represents national strength and identity. The Denver mint mark, the small letter D, identifies the facility responsible for striking the coin. The coin's specifications belong to the copper-nickel-clad era, rather than the earlier silver era, and that is precisely why a seemingly ordinary 1973 D can become interesting. Collectors are not simply collecting metal. They are collecting a physical record of American history, manufacturing technology, die preparation, circulation, and survival. The official Denver mintage of 232,977,400 is substantial, but it should never be interpreted as saying that exactly 232,977,400 collectible quality coins exist today. Many were released into commerce and eventually became worn, damaged, lost, melted as part of bulk handling, discarded, or simply disappeared into collections where they were never documented. More importantly, the population of high-grade coins is dramatically smaller than the original production figure. A quarter can be common in worn grades and surprisingly difficult in exceptional mint state grades. This is one of the central principles of modern numismatics. Rarity is not simply how many pieces were manufactured, it is how many survive in a particular condition, with a particular strike, appearance, variety, and certification status. Current market references place ordinary 1973 D examples close to face value in circulated grades, while exceptional mint state pieces can move into much higher territory. That brings us to the most important question: what happens to a 1973 D quarter that is scratched and toned? In ordinary circumstances, scratches are a major negative because they permanently interrupt the original surface. A coin with obvious scratches generally will not compete with pristine mint state examples, even if the date and mint mark are correct. Tunning, however, is more complicated. Natural tunning can develop through long-term interaction between the metal surface, storage environment, paper, plastic, air, and other materials. Attractive original tunning may sometimes enhance collector appeal, while harsh artificial tunning or chemical treatment can create a very different reaction. The key issue is originality. A naturally toned coin with honest surfaces can tell a more compelling story than a coin that has been aggressively polished to look shiny. But if scratches are severe, the market usually treats the coin primarily as a circulated or impaired example rather than a premium specimen. For a typical circulated 1973 D, expectations should remain realistic. A heavily scratched example may be worth around face value, perhaps with a small premium only if it has something genuinely collectible about it. A problem-free fine or very fine coin generally remains inexpensive. In about uncirculated territory, the value can rise modestly. While ordinary mint state examples can move into the low dollar range, and better preserved pieces can become significantly more desirable. Current published market references show examples around the face value level for circulated pieces, with values increasing through AU and mint state grades. One market compilation lists approximately $1 to $1.50 around MS60, about $5 around MS63, roughly $5 to $7.50 around MS64, and approximately $10 to $20 around MS65, although actual prices vary by grading service, eye appeal, population, and market conditions. These are not guarantees, but they demonstrate the dramatic effect of preservation. Then comes the part that can change the entire conversation: exceptional mint state quality. A 1973 D that somehow survived with almost no contact marks, strong luster, excellent strike quality, clean fields, and superior eye appeal can enter a completely different collecting arena. At the highest levels, tiny differences matter. One coin may grade MS67 while another reaches MS68, and that single numerical step can represent a huge difference in market demand, because the supply of coins at the higher grade becomes extremely limited. PCGS's auction database records a $2,750 result for an NGC MS68 1973D Washington quarter sold through an eBay transaction in August 2022, and the database identifies it as the auction record for the issue. The lesson is extraordinary. The value is not coming from the ordinary quarter itself, but from the extreme scarcity of a top-quality surviving specimen and the willingness of collectors to compete for it. Registry set competition adds another layer to this story. Modern collectors can build competitive sets through certification and registry systems, where coins are ranked according to grade and completeness. When only a tiny number of coins occupy the highest certified grade, a collector seeking the strongest possible set may have enormous incentive to obtain one. That creates a phenomenon where two nearly identical-looking quarters can have dramatically different market positions. One might be a common circulated coin, while another is a condition census or top-grade piece that becomes a trophy for advanced collectors. The documented MS68 result demonstrates exactly why condition matters so much. For the 1973 DPCGS's record page also shows the coin associated with multiple Washington quarter registry categories, illustrating how certified examples can participate in competitive collecting.